A defining change in developed societies since the 1960s has been the incredible acceleration of a broader understanding and acceptance of human experience. From the civil rights movements, gender equality, gay rights, to a new understanding of neurodiversity, or the reality of the menopause. The pace at which these topics are now moving from the academic or underground to mainstream represents either a daunting source of overwhelm or an exciting opportunity, depending on your mindset. So why does this matter to leaders? Well, our job is to inspire and mobilize the economic activity of those who follow us. The more we understand the perspectives and potential of those we lead, the better we can serve their needs to be empowered and fully contribute. The evolving leader is somebody who challenges assumptions about the potential of their people. In this show, Jim Fielding talks to us about his experiences as a gay man ascending to the top of corporate America. Welcome to The Evolving Leader, the show born from the belief that we need deeper, more accountable, and more human leadership to confront the world's biggest challenges. I'm John Gomes, and I'm joined with my co-host, Emma Sinclair. Emma, how are you feeling today?
Hi, John. I am feeling warm. The sun has come out in the UK, so I am feeling warm for a change. I'm also feeling calm. I'm feeling relaxed, had a good day. And feeling very open to this conversation. I've spent several hours listening and being in the presence of our guest today, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. How are you feeling, John?
Yeah, I'm feeling really good, actually. It's the end of the day. We've just started to have summer, as you said. It finally announced itself after weeks, months of rain and cold in the UK, so that's feeling great. And I am mostly very curious and excited to learn more from our guest because, like you, Emma, I've spent several hours immersed in his book. Because today we're joined by Jim Fielding. Jim is a seasoned executive, having held several senior executive roles at DreamWorks and Disney. He's an active angel investor, startup advisor, and philanthropist, currently serving on the board of directors for Indiana University Foundation. He's the president of CoLab at Archer Gray and a brand strategist and advisor. And today we're here to talk to him about his new book, All Pride, No Ego, a queer executive's journey to living and leading authentically. Jim, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Jim, how are you feeling today?
It's funny that you mentioned weather because, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and we are having a beautiful spring rainstorm today. One of those gentle rainstorms that I know means more things are going to bloom. And it's my favorite time of the year here. I love spring, even though we have a ton of pollen. But it just means tomorrow more stuff is going to be blooming. And I love that.
Feels like a long time coming, the summer and the spring. Yeah. Definitely over here. So I'm pleased you got some sunshine and even gentle rain for you today.
Gentle rain.
I like it. So we're going to dive into the central issues of your book, Jim. But before we do, and I know you do this at the very beginning, but it would be brilliant if you could just give it a little perspective, a little potted history of your career and some of those key milestones, if possible, for us.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a child of the Midwest. I was born in the middle of the country, Ohio, and went to school at Indiana. And after Indiana University, really spent the first half of my career in retail, like pure traditional retail, a department store training program, 9 years at the Gap, which I always say was like getting a master's degree in retail because it was the heydays of the Gap, the 80s, the late 80s and through the 90s. And then Land's End, the catalog, and then really the second half of my career was media and entertainment, but always I was always doing the consumer products and experiences within big media companies. So, the bulk of the second half of my career was almost 12 years at Disney, where I rose up from Disney catalog into licensing and merchandising and consumer products, and ultimately spent the last 4 years as president of Disney stores globally. and then moved from there to be the CEO of Claire Stores, the girls' jewelry and accessory store that everybody knows around the world, famous for ear piercing in many places. And then got pulled back into media and entertainment by Jeffrey Katzenberg when he bought Awesomeness TV, which at the time was a multi-channel network that started the creator economy, the YouTube economy. And I did DreamWorks and Awesomeness TV. And then we got purchased. Then it's like the tale of mergers and acquisitions. We got purchased by NBC Universal. I was out of a job. I went to 20th Century Fox to be president of consumer products and experiences, and pretty much thought that's where I was going to retire. Like I was going to do that for 10 years and name my successor. And then, the fickle finger of fate, Disney bought Fox. And so I went through that 18-month merger acquisition, which was painful but necessary, and made sure that everybody was kind of taken care of. And then when that merger closed, I, for the first time in my life, was like, I'm going to take 6 months off. I was tired. I was burnt out. Again, fate is such a big part of my life because that was fall of 2019. And I said, I'm going to take 6 months off and I'll see you again in April 2020. And we all know what happened. The world shut down. And so I really think both, the Disney acquisition of Fox and COVID kind of came together to make me shift gears. And that's where we are today. And that's really where the book came out of that time as well.
Yeah, when you talk about Claire's accessory, as it's called in the UK,
yes.
I spent a best part of a decade going in there every Saturday with my two daughters when they were young. There was a religion that we had to go in there.
It's a moment. It's like a life moment for so many people around the world.
Yeah. You set up All Pride, No Ego, your book, with the reality that many business leaders, especially those who identify as LGBTQ+, struggle with feelings of being excluded and marginalized. Can we set up the pitch for the book? Who's it aimed at? What does it help to understand?
Yeah, I wrote in the dedication of the book that, I dedicated the book to all leaders, but particularly young leaders who feel marginalized in some way. And I really do believe that. I feel like I wrote it for anybody who has felt othered or different or marginalized at some point in their career and felt that they didn't really fit in or that they had to change in order to fit in. And I think the unlock for me, and I know you guys have read and listened to the book, was my editors at Wiley basically said, write the book that 56-year-old Jim should write the book that 26-year-old Jim wished he read, what he had, like it was on the shelf when I was struggling with these very issues. So in a weird way, I wrote the book to myself, but it really is, I think it's for leaders or managers of people of any point in their career, but particularly people who are probably earlier in their career. And it's organized around 10 lessons that I wish I would have learned earlier. Because I'm trying to help people avoid some of the angst and some of the pitfalls that I experienced in my career. I'm not saying follow the path and you'll have the ideal career. It's suggestions. But I'd say it's really for anybody that's felt othered. Although now that I've been out on the book tour, I've had just as many cisgender straight white men come up to me and say they enjoyed the book as anybody else. So I think the reality is there's times in everybody's life where we felt other than the group. And so I think those feelings are very common to people. And I think that's what resonates when they read the book.
Mm.
I really enjoyed listening to your book, and I could definitely see this way that you're writing almost to a former self, a former Jim.
Yeah.
And I really loved that repeated lessons that you shared.
Thank you.
I wonder if we could start at the beginning, where you start your book with your childhood, and you use that to reflect perhaps on how that shaped your character and maybe that sense of being in control in your life. And And at the beginning, it definitely sounds like there were some unhappy moments at that start of your life. You use a wonderful phrase, if I may share, that a complicated unicorn, which I just think is just a wonderful phrase. I'd love you to unpack that for us. But I wonder if you could just talk about that early start and how that really was important for you to shape your leadership, whether that's for better or for worse.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the fact that I'm a firstborn male, I think there was a ton of expectations thrust on me from, my parents and my grandparents, in a good way. I mean, I think there was a lot of excitement when I came. My parents always said, and I always felt, that I was like an old soul. I feel like I've been around a lot. I think I've definitely had some prior lives. And so I was a pretty serious kid early on, and liked books. I mean, I loved reading. I mean, that's one thing I write about in the book. My parents, I think they stuck a book in the crib. And so reading became a huge part of my life. Reading and storytelling is a huge part of my family. I started to have feelings and realizing that maybe I wasn't the same as all the other little boys around 6 or 7. And so I think there was a little angst that came with that because I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know what to do about it, but I knew it wasn't right, especially for where I was growing up. And then, I write, which was probably part of the hardest, but, I grew up in an active alcoholic household. My mom was an alcoholic and my dad was a fireman, which meant he worked 24 hours on and then 48 hours off. And so that every third day thing was like almost a little bit lesson in terror because those tended to be the days where mom was not on her best behavior. And so I realized in writing the book and looking back and looking at my journals that I had to grow up fast because I had a younger sister and I felt it was my responsibility to protect her from it. And I learned how to start anticipating mom's episodes. So I started to learn how to read people. I could read situations quite early, and I was literally the little man of the house because there was many times where she wasn't functioning. And because of that, I think I never really had that pure innocence and joy of childhood. Like I never really was a kid that just played. I never really kind of understood that concept because I always felt this sense of responsibility. Now, ironically, I think that made me a really good manager and executive and leader because I was very empathetic. I was able to handle crisis. I was, proactive. I could see things coming. But I think I lost a lot by not ever having that innocence of childhood. And I think that's why I loved being president of Disney Store and doing things for kids, because in a weird way, I was like reliving something that I had lost. And we had good times too, as I write about in the book. I mean, I give my parents lots of credit, but the complicated unicorn is they had no idea what to do with me. They had no, there was no guidebook for me. And I was so different than my dad and different than my mom, but I was a true blend of the two of them. Like I truly am to this day. And we didn't have the vocabulary. We didn't have the resources. We didn't have the tools to really talk about what was going on. And so we had, as I wrote, Emma, I know you listened, we had this mantra, feelings don't lie. Like we were so proud of that, right? But frankly, it was utter BS because we were lying about everything. Like we were lying about, what was my sexuality that was emerging. We were lying about mom's drinking. And to the outside, we looked like a really good nuclear family. Like we were a very popular family. My sister and I were competitive swimmers. My parents were very involved in that program. We belonged to a boating club. And one of the things that's been funny with the book is the people that truly grew up with me in Toledo, Ohio are like calling me and emailing me and saying, we had no idea. And I'm like, exactly, because we were doing our job. Like we were told to keep it at home, right? And there was no counseling or, Al-Anon or Alateen. It was, we're just dealing with it. And I think because of that, I learned how to compartmentalize. I learned a lot of coping mechanisms, but it required me in my 30s and 40s to go through a lot of therapy that I should have processed when I was in my teens, frankly.
So you wrote the book to your younger self, and as a result, that's a really valuable resource for people who are going through a similar set of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But I also flip that, because as a straight, mostly white man, what I took from it, and what I think other people in my position can take from it, is it allows me to understand something about people, about, you know, in going through these experiences of life, that is very difficult to understand when you are looking at it purely through the lens of I don't know the right language to use and so on, the kind of real experience of life that you have. And I'd be really fascinated to understand, as you know, kind of like the journey you went on as an executive, particularly in corporate America, which, you know, is probably different from other parts of the world as well, but a sense of how things have changed in terms of how you felt about yourself as a gay man in corporate America. Where were the inflection points on that journey?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many. I started my career in the closet. You know, my first job out of college, I was living the double life and not sharing my personal situation, changing pronouns. I had a partner, but they were always they. It was like very gender neutral. Like they weren't involved in, you know, no company picnics, no Christmas parties, like very, very closeted, because I believed and had been socialized that by being a gay man, I was going to marginalize myself and limit my career opportunities. And I was very career oriented. I was very success oriented and ambitious and driven. But early in my life, like 24, 25, it started to have physical and mental manifestations where I started to get migraines and stomach issues. And I would go to the doctor, and, you know, naively, they'd be like, you know, your blood pressure's up and this and that. Like I was having older person's issues. And they'd say, you know, they'd test me for everything. And they'd say, well, how's your stress? And I'd sit there and lie through the whole thing, be like, oh, my stress is great, right? Like I'm fine. But it wasn't, because I was like totally living this double life and thinking the whole thing. And that was really the first inflection point. I realized that I was going to have to leave that company and look for an opportunity, like basically to come out. Like I was going to have to find a company where I was going to be able to be myself, because I was literally physically hurting myself by not. And that's when I went to the Gap. And, you know, I talk about in the book that I interviewed as an out gay man for the first time in my life. And it doesn't mean I showed up, and I have to tell you this all the time, it doesn't mean I showed up in like rainbow sweaters at the interview, right? And like carrying my pride flag, but it just meant that I didn't change pronoun. If they asked me about, you know, is there someone in your life, or what do you do on the weekends? I would say he, him. And in a weird way, it was a litmus test. I was watching the interviewers to see if there was any flinching, right? Or to see if I didn't get another interview. But I had done my homework. And again, this is the 80s, so it wasn't like the internet and stuff. But I mean, you know, Gap was based in San Francisco. They had domestic partner benefits earlier than other people. And so I thought, okay, they probably are a good environment. And it turned out to be. And I think my career trajectory took off when I left my first company and went to the Gap. I had an amazing 9 years there because I was bringing all of me. I was bringing my full authentic self. And it was like I had lost 100 pounds because I wasn't carrying around this monkey on my back that I was hiding. And in San Francisco, I got super involved in the community because San Francisco obviously was a mecca for the gay community. Unfortunately, I moved there at the height of the AIDS crisis, but that also got me involved in the community because there was a community. And for the first time in my life, I felt people around me. And I actually came out corporately before I came out to my parents. And so I was still not telling my truth to my parents, even though, you know, I moved to San Francisco. And then my sister kind of forced my hand on that, which was great because she knew. And, you know, it was rough. My dad didn't talk to me for a year, but I think when that all came together, when we finally all came together and got through the estrangement, that's when I felt like I was finally, you know, I was like 27 years old and I was finally living my true self. And so all of that angst from say 7 to 27 started to dissipate, and I was able to start dealing with some reality. And that's when I started therapy and really, you know, more journaling and more meditation because, you know, I was me. I was finally me. And I think every other job since then, when I was recruited for jobs or applied for jobs, it was just I was me. Like you were getting the whole package. You either took what I was or you didn't. And if I was going to be uncomfortable somewhere, I wouldn't take that job.
How do you think corporate America as a whole has kind of changed through that?
It's evolved tremendously, but I always caveat this, and you bring it up, especially for your listeners internationally. Sadly, it completely depends on geography. It completely depends, within the United States, even what cities you live in, what states you live in. It's no lie that the queer community is under attack again around the world, and particularly in the United States. There's over 400 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation active in the United States right now. And so I always caveat this when I talk that like my experiences living in California, working in San Francisco are very different than somebody who's living in Texas or living in Florida or living in Oklahoma. And but I do think it's better today. I mean, the emergence of employee resource groups, pride groups, just the number of companies that celebrate June Pride Month now and celebrate it with authenticity and true allyship. It is a different environment, but you need to do your research. You need to do your research on the company. You need to do your research on the municipality. And I tell young people that, particularly people who are interviewing, you interview that company as much as they're interviewing you, because you need to know that you're going to be comfortable there. And I also am not let's knock down the closet doors and everybody needs to come out and dance around the maypole. I mean, the first thing that has to happen is you have to have physical and psychological safety. And if you are not safe at work, then of course, stay in the closet, because you need a job, you need money, you need benefits, and you should not put yourself in physical or psychological harm's way. I'd never take that for granted. And I've met a lot of people who unfortunately can't be out at work for whatever their circumstances are. But then I coach them that I hope when you're not at work, you can embody your true self in whatever you do in your personal life. But is it better today than it was 5 years ago? Yes. Is it better today than it was 10 years ago? Yes. However, this last year and a half in the election cycle we're in, it's a tough time again.
I was just wondering, as you were talking there, what the reality of an organization looks like that really is open to anybody. Because as you talk, that must feel very exhausting to have to mask who you are. Not you personally, just generally to mask who you are. And I just wonder for anyone listening out there, what is a really good cue of an organization that is properly open and not perhaps, as you said, in your book, like pride washing and marking all the right moments in time, but what does that look like really?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emma. I mean, well, the first thing I talk about in the book and in my talks around the country is, are they in allyship and support of the community 12 months a year and not just the month of June, right? It's really easy. I talk about pride washing and rainbow washing. It's like all of a sudden June 1st comes and the rainbows pop up around the office and you're like, okay, is this real or not, right? But if they're really in it year round, and you can check if they, again, do they have an employee resource group? And not just for LGBTQ, do they have a Black Lives Matter, employee resource group? Do they have a women's group? Do they have an AAPI group? Do they have a Latinx group? It's really about marginalized communities having voices. One thing that I tell young people, and they're always surprised when I say this, is check the benefits. Do they have mental health benefits, right? A lot of times people will have physical benefits like going to the doctor or going to the dentist or going to the eye doctor, but you won't have mental health benefits. And unfortunately, in our communities, mental health benefits are really important. So ask, do you have, are you allowed to see counselors? Do you have subsidized mental health benefits? I think that's a really good indication that they care holistically about people, not just about, obviously vision and dental and medical is important, but mental. What kind, the great news with the internet, what kind of programs have they done for marginalized communities through the years? You can research that. And also looking at their management and their representation, like what does it look like? When you get to the C-suite, it's not just are there gay people, but are there women in the C-suite? Are there people of color in the C-suite? What's the makeup of their board of directors, right? I mean, if the board of directors is, 9 65-year-old straight white men, I'm not sure that they're really practicing what they're talking about. And I think there are ways, and there's tools. There's so many tools on the internet. Glassdoor is a great one where you can actually just go in and do some social listening and find people in the community to ask them. I also tell people, go on LinkedIn and do a search and see if you know anybody that works at that company and send them, just ask them questions. Are you happy there? Are you productive there? Do you feel respected there? I think that's ways that you can kind of say, okay, this company seems to be putting their support truly, authentically. And then there's other companies that have come out, probably you guys know more in the United States, and have been like, we actively don't support, like there's people that have said, we do not support the LGBTQ community. I mean, I could name, I won't go into it, but I could name 5 companies off the top of my head. And I'm like, well, as an LGBTQ person, I don't know why you'd ever apply for a job there. If they've actively said they don't support it, it's like, there are jobs available. There are other companies to go to. Like, don't bang your head against the wall. If they've said that, which, by the way, is their right, freedom of speech, First Amendment, I would not take myself there. But I tell young people that, not young people, but anybody who's interviewing, I'm like, do the research on the company. It's your job to do the research.
So we turn the kind of perspective here for a moment and go, I'm a leader listening into the show right now, and it would be really helpful for me to understand not just about what you experience, but what would help you from a leadership perspective to bring your full self to work and to feel truly valued in the context of this, not just from a benefits point of view, but from a leadership point of view. What are the leaders that have really enabled that? And what can anybody listening into the show do differently or start to learn to help bring out the best across the board in the people that they serve?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and I think it's been challenging in the last couple of years because of all these definitions of workplace now, right? I mean, a lot of my career was spent in a very physical, where we were all in the same office at least 4.5 days a week. And so a lot of the things I talk about are kind of physical techniques, but I've adapted them now for this hybrid and virtual work world. I mean, I think leaders, and it's pretty cliche, but I mean, you have to walk the walk and talk the talk, right? And it's if you want your people to feel included and safe and a sense of belonging, you have to create that environment. And that means gathering physically or virtually at times where you're not just focused on the business tasks at hand, but you truly get to know the people and you enable people to share their stories. And I think as a leader, straight, gay, black, white, female, male, like you sharing your story, your authenticity sets that tone that like, oh, okay, John's sharing this, Emma's sharing this, we're allowed to in this environment. And I think that tone starts, and I tell companies that I advise now, it starts in the interviewing and recruiting process, right? I mean, it really starts in one of the things that I did as a leader. Even, I mean, when I was CEO of Claire's, I couldn't do it because Claire's was so big and so geographic. But at certain levels of the company, I made sure that I spent at least 15 minutes with any candidate before they got their offer, because I wanted to feel them and I wanted them to feel me before we actually made the offer, right? And so that on day one, when they started, I already had some kind of a connection with them. And that was a conscious effort I made as leader. At Disney Store, I definitely did it. Manager and above at Disney Store around the world, either virtual or in person, I was part of the interview process. It was always at the end, they'd been through everybody else. There might be 2 finalists and they wanted me to see both of them. I think setting that tone of what we are as a culture, because it's really about what your culture is, starts in the interview and recruiting process. And then I think it starts in the orientation and training and day one process. And again, as a leader, I was always involved in day one. I was always involved in week one. I didn't want to be this absent like figurehead that was like in the quote corner office. I wanted them to see that I was going to roll up my sleeves and work just as hard as they were, and that I was as passionate and committed to the mission and vision as I wanted them to be. And so I think a lot of it is just, as a leader, you just have to realize the spotlight is on you. People are watching you. They're watching for cues. They're watching for behaviors, and you set the tone. And then I think a lot of it for me is hiring the right people at that next level, right? Who also embody that mission and vision and culture, because they actually probably spend more time with the teams in person than I did. So I think, but they're a direct reflection on you as a leader, right? So if I give someone a director title or a VP title or put them in charge of a function, then that means that they are a culture fit as well. And by the way, I still manage diversity. I never wanted 150 clones of myself. We would have killed each other, and we wouldn't have gotten anything done, right? It probably would have been fun, but we wouldn't have gotten anything done. You need, I needed I always talked about I love my finance people, but I needed my bean counter finance people who kept me honest and were most comfortable sitting in a cube, just running numbers and scenarios all day long. That was their authenticity. And I loved that about them. And I needed to create an environment that they were as comfortable as the salespeople were, who were like the big extroverts and who wanted to go out and tell the story all the time. I think inclusiveness, belonging, DEI, it's really about managing, bringing out everybody's authenticity, whatever authenticity that is. And I'm super proud of the teams and cultures I built over the years.
Can I ask a question before I just move on to another part of your book? And it's around the word allyship. And I'd just love to understand your take on what that really is. What does that look like, feel like? How do people experience that? And how can you become a great ally?
This is such a great question. I mean, we could do a whole podcast just on allyship. Right. And it's funny, I wrote in my book, Emma and John, I know you read, I never had a gay boss. If you think about that, I never had a gay boss my entire career. And so really, I had ally bosses. I had straight men and women who were my bosses, but who created an environment where they were like, here's my expectations, here's my goals. What do you need from me? I'm going to support you. Okay, now go fly. Right. And I think one of the most important things as an ally is having the vulnerability to go up to somebody and say, I don't fully understand your lifestyle. I don't fully understand your lived experience, but I want to be there for you. And I want you to teach me. I want you to educate me, by being open and being an active listener. And if I make mistakes, I think this is important, especially important lately with the transgender community and the pronouns. I make mistakes with pronouns all the time. But I would say to people, I'm so sorry if I made a mistake in the pronoun. Please tell me that so that I learn from that and I never make that mistake again. I think that's pure allyship. I don't want to say it's unconditional support, because I think there's still conditions in it when you work in a corporate environment. I mean, you still have goals and you still need to be held accountable to your goals and things. But it's that allyship is something that makes people feel, I say it a lot, I've said it already in this, psychologically safe. I feel like it's not a career limiting move for me to make a mistake. It's not a career limiting move for me to speak my mind and have an opinion. It's not a career limiting move for me to be who I am and talk about my partner or my husband or my significant other. And again, so much of it is in actions, but I think it's also in words, by people being vulnerable enough to say, like I said, it's not my lived experience, but I want to understand yours and what I can do to make you more productive and more psychologically safe. It's unfortunately, again, I think in person, virtually, it's communication. It's having those discussions together. It's no different than me when a woman, I had people that worked for me when a woman got pregnant and, and their life changes when they become a mom or they have twins and things like that. I don't understand that experience. I'm not a parent, but I want to understand that experience because I realize now that you have different priorities. You're a working mother. You're a working mother of twins. Okay, tell me about that. Like, what do we need to do to help you still feel part of the team and feel productive? And that it's like I needed to be an ally for that person. I'm not Black. I need to be an ally for the Black community, right? So a lot of it is about just asking open-ended questions and getting into those discussions and being prepared to change, to support.
And in the book, I mean, you bring out, because the core of what you're talking there in terms of being a good ally is staying open and curious to new experiences. And
100%.
that requires, because when you're busy and you're trying to get things done and tick things off and be certain and so on, that actually requires a state to be in where you have to kind of calm yourself down to be able to engage in somebody else's experience. What have you learned about how you do that switch from the kind of action mode to the empathy mode?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it, I think that's part of where the title of the book came from too, because I also think it takes a tremendous amount of humility because you have to admit a lot of times as leaders, like when you get to the C-suite and you get that president title and that CEO title, like people expect you to have all the answers, right? They expect you, well, you have that title, you must be able to make all these decisions. And so I think it takes a tremendous amount to kind of park your ego and be like, you know what? I don't know how to handle this situation, or I've never been in this situation before, and I need to ask some open-ended questions. And my management style has always been two heads are better than one. I say in the book, like if you came to my office or you stopped me in the hallway with a problem, I was always going to ask you, well, what would you do before I just offered a solution? Because I saw that as a teachable moment. But honestly, many times I wanted to know because I knew they'd already thought about a solution or they wouldn't have ever been bringing me the problem, right? I actually wanted to hear how they were going to solve it because, again, I don't always have all the answers. So I think it's really about staying grounded and staying humble. And that's where your empathy comes from. And listen, my mom always said to me, that's why they pay you the big bucks. Like you have to make decisions sometimes. Sometimes you're just in management mode, leadership mode, and you are ticking off the boxes. But it's about finding those moments in the day or in the week or in the month where you are just kind of observing and you're not doing. I talk a lot about I want to be a human being, not just a human doing. I think if you're feeling like you're just moving from meeting to meeting to meeting and you're just shooting, problem solving and everything else, it's incumbent upon you to say, whoa, I need a break, right? I need to put a break in here. I need to just, and even if that meant I'm definitely an open door manager, but there's times I closed my door and was like, I'm going to take a half an hour. And sometimes I put my head down on the desk, or sometimes I just looked out the window, or sometimes I read a book, because you can, as a leader, get caught up in that where you're just like in decision mode. And I think, again, it comes back to your humility and controlling your ego to stop and breathe, basically.
Do you have any go-to questions that you use to open your mind, or when you're in a group situation and you can feel it closing down? Is there anything that you use particularly?
Yeah, that's great. One of them I just talked about is a lot of times I would have to say to myself, don't solve it, Jim, right? Like if somebody would ask me a question, my initial inclination is usually be like, if somebody would say to me black or white, let's just play that. My initial inclination would be like black, right? Because I'm just trying to move on and close it. And I would literally say to myself, Jim, ask them, turn it on them. Well, what do you prefer? And tell me why, right? Like make it a discussion. Don't make it like a one way. I always found Mondays particularly interesting in an office situation because you can get into conversations about what did you do over the weekend, right? Like, and I truly wanted to know what they did over the weekend. If they were willing to share, did their kids have a sporting event? Did they go to a play? Did they go to a concert? Did they play in a park? Did they cook something? I always ask questions about, we did a lot of potlucks and stuff. I think food is a great safe discussion topic, like favorite foods and having people bring in their food. Like I always loved at Christmas on our teams, we always did like Christmas cookie exchanges, right? And everybody would bring in their famous Christmas treats and Christmas biscuits and things like that. I think there's so much storytelling in that. Like, that's what I would do, Emma, is I'd be like, well, why did you bring those cookies? Like, I would literally say, like, okay, you brought those cookies. And 9 times out of 10, it would be like their grandmother's recipe or their mother's recipe, or this is the cookie we always make in our family. You learn so much about people from that. And it can be in 3 minutes, right? It's not like it has to be this intense therapy session. And I think that's the constantly curious. I am constantly fascinated by people. I think people are so interesting and they're all evolving. And so I just have this natural curiosity about people. And I think I love and I also am blessed with a good memory. So I would remember their spouses' names. I'd remember their kids' names. And I'd be able to, it's so funny now because some people have worked with me for over 25 years. I've watched them like have the child. Now the child's graduating from college. Now the child's getting married. And I always make this joke that like, that can't be possible because we're not any older. Like, how did that happen? Right. But I think it just makes, as a leader, it just makes you real, right? Because sometimes I think we put on airs as leaders or managers that are it's not natural. I mean, we're normal too. And I want you to like the cookies that I made for the exchange, which were probably my grandmother's recipe.
So you make me want cookies now.
I know. I'm thinking about Christmas and hearing this. I'm like, I need to do some kind of cookie exchange.
I'm gonna ask you another question. I'm gonna take you back into the realms of Disney. But when you left Disney and became CEO at Claire's, you mentioned that Bob Iger, their Disney CEO, gave you some very good advice. What was that? Can you share with others?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I got, and full credit to Bob Iger, the fact that I got an exit interview with the CEO of the Walt Disney Company when I resigned is shocking. And the fact that it was scheduled for a half an hour and he extended it because we were having such a great conversation. And the biggest things I took away from that is he told me, because I had never been a CEO, right? And he said, this is what you have to do as a CEO, is like hire the right people and let them go, set the mission and vision and make sure that everybody on the team understands it, and support your creatives, because he knew I was going to Claire's, and Claire's is about product development and everything, and support your creatives at all costs, which is basically the same thing he did, because the creatives are like the gasoline in your engine, right? The petrol in your engine. And he gave me very specific tips about even managing creatives and how to not make the creative process like hierarchical and lots of checkoffs, like that really, if you hire, in his case, a creative meant like a filmmaker or a television maker, a series, a writer or an animator or, somebody like that. In my case, it was more of like a designer or a product developer. But it was the same principle of set your expectations and then let them go. And one of the things that I've said, which is the same thing he said, I've said it different ways now, is hire people that are smarter than you are and hire people that scare you, are two things that Bob and I talked about. Is again, I think Bob, even though he's one of the most respected leaders in the world, when you do get to spend time with him, he's a very humble man, and he does identify talent, and that was 2012. And I hear him so clearly in my head in 2024. Like, I hear his voice. That conversation was huge.
We had Michael D. Watkins, who wrote a book called The First 90 Days, which is being bought by hundreds of people making the transition to CEO, and being bought by 2 million people in total.
Yeah.
Transition to CEO is not an easy ride.
Not at all.
What did you learn about taking on Claire's in the rearview mirror?
I learned that I was ready. I was probably 80% ready for that job. I was ready creatively, store operations, product, knowing the customer, guest experience. What I wasn't ready for was private equity, investor relations, debt finance. And that's because I had been only working in large publicly traded companies where, frankly, managing the debt and the stock price of Disney was not my job, right? Managing the board of directors. And so where I wasn't prepared was in managing a board of directors, in managing debt investors and managing Wall Street. And I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I could have taken some classes, or maybe I could have tried to get more involved with it at Disney. But to go from a large Fortune 50 company to a private equity held company, I was not ready for that financial side of it. The good news was I had an amazing CFO who was there when I got there, and I retained, and he taught me a lot quickly when you talk about those first 90 days. But in hindsight, I would have liked to have been a little bit more prepared for that. The other thing I learned, quite honestly, was private equity owned companies have a lot of debt, usually because of how it happened. And that debt becomes a real burden. I mean, you're managing the debt, you're managing the interest payments, and that encumbers you from doing some of the things you want to do with the business, because the first thing you have to do is pay your debt. And I don't think I was fully cognizant of that as well. I learned it very quickly. I was prepared for the globalness of it. What Claire's was in 40 countries. That didn't overwhelm me. Flying around the world and meeting with all the different cultures and languages and all that didn't overwhelm me. But I'd say it was like the finance PE part and the board management. The other thing is, I think, and I love that book you mentioned, The First 90 Days. I got that book, and then another book that they gave me was You're the CEO, Now What? Which is kind of like a gross title, but it's good. Is the other thing you forget about when you're the CEO is you have no peers in the company. I mean, you literally are the pinnacle. And in my life, even when I was a president at Disney, there was other presidents at Disney, right? You could call somebody and say, how did you deal with this? Like, did this ever happen to you? All of a sudden, you're it, right? Like everybody on the team works for you. And I found that I had to network with other I was in Chicago with Claire, Chicago-based CEOs, because I wanted that. Like, again, that two heads are better than one. And a big learning for me was the CEOs that I bonded the most with in Chicago were female CEOs. I think being a gay man and the female, I think we had some similar feelings about managing the boardroom and kind of moving in that world. So the Mary Dillon, who was the CEO of Ulta, was an incredible friend and advisor. Sally Pofscher, who was the CEO of PaperSource, was incredible. Mindy Grossman, who wasn't based in Chicago, but was the CEO of Home Shopping Network, and then Weight Watchers, were people that I went to for advice and counsel.
You mentioned in there this concept of the CEO being, I think you called it quite like a lonely place. And there's a chapter in your book where you talk about the need to build family. And it's the family that you choose to embrace. And I wondered if you just talk a little bit about what that really means and how that transpires in your leadership.
Yeah, and this is definitely old Jim talking to young Jim, and old Jim talking to young people is, I am blessed after we got through some issues with a great natural family. I have a great sister. My mom is great. My dad has passed, but we were in a great place before he passed. And extended family. But not everybody in the queer community can say that, right? Sometimes because of religion or beliefs or anything, people are ostracized by living their authenticity. And that's where the concept of chosen family came from. And it really is these family of friends and confidants that you come to rely on in a familial way, who are not your natural birth relatives, but are really the people who have your back and love you unconditionally. I think those of us I think most people, but particularly in marginalized communities, all we're really craving is unconditional love and unconditional support. We want to be fully accepted for who we are. And when you look at drag culture, when you look at ballroom culture, the concept of family, drag families, things like that really came out of that culture and I think permeated our entire queer community. And if you would have told Jim at 18 when he went to Indiana University that the person he shared a phone with and the people that lived across the hall were going to be his best friends when he was 58, I would have been like, you're on drugs, because this is like the lottery. Like we got assigned to each other purely by some computer putting us in the same dormitory. And for me to wake up, and I write about this group, I have this group of 12 people from university that are my ride or die and my truth tellers. I talk a lot about truth telling. And most importantly, are the ones who love Jim, JD, James for Jim, not because he worked at Disney, not because he was a president or CEO of Claire's. These people love me for me. And by the way, will call out my BS when I become arrogant or, when I'm not there for them. And I don't think when you're 18, you ever look at those people and think, 40 years from now, I'm going to have been through marriages and divorces and deaths and births of children and graduations and everything else. And I just think it's so valuable. And then my work family that I formed, I have this incredible group of people that have been very loyal and very supportive, that have moved with me from company to company. And that has been such an asset because we have a shorthand with each other that just makes things go faster. And it's not like a clique or a cult, but it's just these shared experiences where I can look at somebody and say, remember when we did this with trolls at DreamWorks? And people will be like, oh, I know what he's talking about. And then they go off and do it. It just makes life easier and it makes it more pleasant. And everything I am today is because I've worked with some incredible people who let me make mistakes, let me try some things, and who I grew up with, basically, if you think about it. I mean, some of the people I worked with at Fox, I had worked with for 20 years, and they had grown and I had grown together.
Another kind of significant part of the book is, and this is again, I think, talking to the younger Jim, is about how you've come to change your relationship to what success looks like. When's enough? Can you talk to us about that?
That's I love that you read that. I mean, it's one of my favorite chapters because it's also got a lot of comedy in it, because my sister and I are, there's only the two of us, but, for your listeners, I say that I'm Four Seasons and she's Hampton Inn, and I don't understand. Like, we grew up the same way, but why is my sister is so much more simple than I am, and so much more appreciative of simple life, and doesn't need 5-star accommodations, and I do. But what I had to come to, and again, came to very late in life with the help of therapists and executive coaches, is that I was doing a lot of things seeking external validation. And I think that was the insecurities of little gay Jimmy. And so I was very hung up on my house and what car I was driving and where I was vacationing, and external trappings and external validation to show that I was successful, instead of really owning that I felt successful internally, and that I was on this treadmill. I just was running to keep up, keeping up, in America, we say keeping up with the Joneses. I was just keeping up and keeping up and keeping up, but wasn't really feeling satisfied in my soul. And once I was mature enough to say, I'm getting off that treadmill and I'm going to stop seeking that external validation, and I'm really going to dive into what makes me happy, my definition of success changed. And it became, I also think it's a symptom of aging, because your body starts to change and you start to think about health, and you start to think about, I just had a knee replacement surgery 3 weeks ago, right? And so when you have a joint replacement surgery, priorities change, things change. When my mom, as I talk about a little bit in the book, but it's been more my reality the last 2 or 3 years, when my mom has dementia. When she was diagnosed with dementia, that changed everything in our lives, right? Because it was really about precious moments when you have her with you, that you're just maximizing those times when she's fully there and fully present. And I wish I had learned from my sister earlier, and I wish I had defined success differently earlier so that I could appreciate it more. Because I think there's a lot of times in my life I kind of just went through the moment and didn't fully appreciate it.
Thank you.
So today there is a lot of turmoil. You mention it around diversity issues, particularly at the moment in the US and different areas. What's your current assessment of these tensions, and more importantly, how do we move forward from them?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing, again, this kind of goes to the vulnerability and ego, is, I mean, the emotions I would use to describe myself as an American citizen living in 2024 in this election cycle again: scared, frustrated, concerned. Some days I'm shocked that we're having these conversations in 2024 and it feels like we're back in the 50s and 60s. But then I say, well, we've been here before. You know, we fought through the AIDS crisis. We fought for civil rights. We fought for the right to marry as a queer community, and we're in another fight. And I think this is where I talk about in the book, just by living your life, you become an activist, and representation matters. And I think this is why where I am right now with this book, being out on the road, doing speaking appearances, appearing at bookstores, is I have to share my story, because the only narrative about the queer community can't be coming from, in our case, the far right, who are accusing us of horrible things and are banning books and banning drag shows and telling stories that aren't true. And so I think the way to counteract that is to by being visible and being representative and by telling your stories. But I won't lie, I have been on this book tour. I have been in the state of Texas where I've had to have bodyguards at my speaking appearances. That's not a great feeling. That's not where they're checking people at the door who are coming into a book signing. That's not a great feeling. It's our reality right now. And I feel like all of us that we're like the elders in the community now. Unfortunately, I'm getting ready to turn 60 next year. I think it's us that have to try and role model the behavior for the younger people, like to create these safe and inclusive spaces. And as I mentioned earlier, there's certain states, the state of Florida, the state of Texas, the state of Oklahoma are not kind to our community right now. And I feel for my brothers and sisters that live there. And there's people that are leaving, the people who have the means to leave and, can get a job somewhere else. But as I say, and you'll understand this even though you're overseas, not all the gay people can live in California and Washington and Oregon and New Jersey and New York. Like, we can't all just be ostracized into these certain safe states. There's queer people in every state in America, and we need to help them live their authenticity. But there's days it's super frustrating, Emma, I won't lie. But the rhetoric between the right and the left, and I know you have versions of it in London, in UK as well. I've never seen it like this, where we can't, it's almost like we need to go back, in the States, we took civics classes. Like, how do you have civil discourse? How do you respectfully disagree without it degenerating into horrible fights and bullying and, in some cases, outright conflict? And I think we just have to get back to kindness and respecting everybody's right to their opinion.
As we kind of come to the end of our time, I'd like
Sure.
to turn to something a bit more hopeful, which is the work you do in philanthropy. Why it matters to you would be really great to hear, and what you're doing and what it's bringing to your life as a leader.
Yeah, again, I give my parents and grandparents credit because I didn't realize I grew up in a philanthropic household. But my parents and grandparents were very involved in a variety of groups in Toledo, Ohio. And even every year, something as simple as what we call Toys for Tots, where my mother would make us go clean out our closets every year and donate toys before Santa came, was something that was ingrained in us. And I was a student who graduated from Indiana University with student debt. I had loans, I had grants, and it took me till I was 30 years old. I graduated at 22 to pay off all that debt. And so that was a burden. I thought of it as an investment in myself, but it was a burden. And so one of my driving forces in philanthropy is I create scholarship funds because I'm trying to help ease the burden of the cost of an education, and the cost of an education into 4-year college is definitely going up. So that's one of my major drivers. One of my other favorite scholarships that we created as a family, and it was after my dad passed, it was really in honoring him. It's called the Student Advocacy and Leadership Scholarship at Indiana University. And it's to pay for people to go to seminars and classes and conferences, particularly queer students, to learn how to be an advocate, to learn how to be a public speaker, to learn how to be passionate about a cause and how to work within the community and how to work in nonprofits and be a community organizer. And then the work I've done, with Make-A-Wish and the Red Cross, and it's what pulls at my heartstrings. And I'm blessed that I was in a position financially to be able to dedicate part of my earnings to giving back. And, I've lived with this mantra my whole life: may we leave our corner of the world a little better than we found it. I think that's where philanthropy comes from, is I'm not naming buildings. I'm not building universities. I'm trying to do small things that make a difference in people's lives and make their lives easier.
I've got one more question. Do you mind?
Sure.
Why is Jiminy Cricket your favorite Disney?
Oh, I love this. A couple answers. Number one, it's truly Pinocchio is the first movie I remember seeing in a theater with my mother. Now, again, for your listeners who are savvy, that does not mean I saw it when it originally came out, because somebody said, Jim, you're lying. I'm like, no, it was a re-release, right? But I remember going to the theater with my mother, and Pinocchio is a pretty dark movie, actually. It's got a lot of themes in it. But if you think about Jiminy, what Jiminy represents in that movie, he's a best friend. He's a moral conscience. He's like on your shoulder, right? And I think I wrote in the book that I actually didn't like being a firstborn, Emma, right? I actually wished I had an older brother or an older sister. I wanted someone to guide me a little bit. I think that's what I thought of as Jiminy. As I got older, I also came to appreciate the design of Jiminy and his art and he's a snappy little dresser and his umbrella and stuff. And at Disney, on the first day, they ask you who your favorite character is, and you don't realize at the time, but that then goes on your name badge. And so that lived with me for 12 years at Disney, and I've collected a ton of like I would go to Disney collector things, and I'd buy all little tchotchke Jiminy things. I really do love him, but it's mostly because he represents conscience and he represents morality in that movie, and he tries to protect Pinocchio from doing some bad things.
Do you have a favorite Disney character, John?
Oh, I'd have to think about that, because that's not an easy one just to come off.
There's a wide, it's especially now with Marvel and everything, and Lucas. There's so many Disney quote characters. It's a quite wide universe to choose from.
Well, probably my 5-year-old self would have said Mowgli.
Yeah,
nice.
Because I love the
That's
jungle.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
But, I love Belle from Beauty and the Beast.
She's a very popular princess. Yes. Well, she was also the smart princess, right? She read books and she took care of her father, and yeah. It's funny when you would read on people's name badges, again, great icebreaker. You start to get to know somebody. Like if I saw you, John, and you had Mowgli on there, I would start not to make assumptions about you, but you're like, oh, wow, he chose Mowgli. Okay. And it's a great conversation starter in a corporate setting to say, John, why Mowgli? What Emma just did to me. Jim, why Jiminy? People who choose Cruella de Vil or Jafar, right? Who choose a villain. And you're like, oh, okay. She chose Cruella de Vil. What's that about? Right? Like it's a great conversation starter.
I love the fact in your book you say that some people have a villain one day and then they'll have a hero the other day.
Yeah, they take it so seriously, and they'd say, can I have another name badge? I want a villain and a hero. And then you'd kind of be like, oh God, they're wearing the villain today. What's that mean, right? Jafar, right? Mufasa from Lion King. How can Mufasa from Lion King be your favorite? I mean, he's horrible, but some people, that was their favorite villain, right? It kind of tells you a lot about him. And of course, corporate HR was be like, this is classic Disney. They can't have 2 name badges. I'm like, oh, come on. How much are they? $1, right? And we just did it at Disney Store. It's in the book. They know now I'm gone. I would be like, just make them another badge. Make them 2 badges. Come on. It was storytelling. That's what we're all about. It was storytelling.
Jim, what's next for you after you've done this round of promoting the book? What's your next kind of chapter?
Yeah, well, I'm super excited because I'm going back to school this summer. I'm going to Emory University here in Atlanta, their graduate school. I'm going to get 2 certificates in executive coaching. I really want to do executive coaching, kind of one-on-one mentoring work. I've got a deal to write a 2nd and 3rd book, so I want to get going on those. And I'm doing a lot of corporate speaking engagements, which makes me really, really happy, particularly when we were talking about the DEI fight and pride and all those kind of things. And so really, for me, 2025 and on, I really want to be spending time in this community and platform that the book has created for me.
Well, Jim, it's been an absolute delight, a pleasure.
Oh my God, my pleasure.
Thank
you for reading, listening, researching. It makes it so fun. And yeah, I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
And we will, for our listeners, put full details of how you can get in touch with Jim. You should read his book. It's a really insightful.
Or listen. It's
journey.
a great
Or listen.
Yes.
Spend 6.5 hours with me. Emma did. And if you contact me through any of the social media that John and Emma are going to give you, it is me. It's not an AI bot getting back to you. It really is me. And I respond to all the messages, and it's been amazing.
Brilliant. Jim, thank you. And
thank you.
To our listeners, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?